Chapter 8, Varieties of American Nationalism. In this chapter, we're looking at the United States as we move beyond the War of 1812 and further into the 19th century. And we will see that as America moves further into the 1800s, we will undergo a pretty dramatic change. There's a shift in the way Americans live their lives, from economics to politics to even where they live geographically within the country. America is growing and developing. And unfortunately, as we move further into the century, we will also see the beginnings of sectionalism and the slavery question rise up to eventually lead us into the Civil War as we move into the 1860s. But for now, we're going to focus on America as we exit the War of 1812. So we're going to talk about the market revolution, the change in the way that Americans buy and sell things in the United States. We're going to talk about the rise of the West and how this idea of manifest destiny really begins to develop in the United States. And then lastly, we'll finish up with the era of good feelings. And I've got the question mark there because we'll determine whether or not it really was an era of good feelings after all. So the market revolution, rise of the West, and the era of good feelings. Let's start off with this new economy. The new economy. In the first half of the 19th century, we're going to see a market revolution that is spurred on by things such as advances in transportation and in communication. The first thing that happens is that after the War of 1812, we see a post-war economic boom, and then shortly thereafter a post-war economic crash. And so we see very high highs and very low lows. And what that shows us is that we need a secure economic foundation. We need some sort of institution to stabilize the economy of the United States. And our answer for that is a new national bank. Remember, we already had a national bank under Alexander Hamilton's plan. Well, this is basically the second bank of the U.S. is essentially the same as the first, only even larger. So we do see that occur in the United States after the War of 1812. We see the passage of the second bank of the U.S. Now, in the 1700s, frontier families in the United States were pretty much self-sufficient. They grew the food they ate. They sewed their own clothes. They cooked their own soap. You know, the stuff they needed to live, they had to provide for themselves. There's very little trade in the United States because it's very difficult to ship goods across the United States. So most families had to create what they needed to live on their own. As we move further into the 1800s, we see that is going to change. For one thing, after the War of 1812, America is going to be flooded by British goods. We said that one of the consequences or one of the impacts of the War of 1812 is it solidifies the relationship between the United States and Great Britain, and they become our biggest trading partner again. And since they are more technologically advanced than we are, they can create goods cheaper than we can. We are going to see a flood of cheap British goods into the United States. But beyond that, we also see new technology, specifically new transportation technology. We see toll roads being built. Now, toll roads are private roads that are maintained by a company in order to generate a profit. We will see that toll roads do not take off in the United States because they're simply not efficient enough. The technology to build and maintain the roads is simply not present in the United States, so they're not very popular. What is more popular are steamboats. Robert Fulton is going to design the first commercially successful steamboats. Rapid transportation, both downstream and upstream. It helps lead into what's known as the Canal Age. So after the War of 1812, America becomes flooded with cheap British goods, and when you combine that with this new transportation technology, that creates what's known as a market revolution. For the first time in many Americans' lives, they are buying the stuff they need to live rather than making it themselves. Now, one reason people are so interested in advances in technology and communication is this desire to move west. In fact, I mentioned earlier, this idea of manifest destiny. We think that we are destined by God. We are the chosen people, and we have not just the opportunity, but the obligation to move west and take our culture and government and spread it across the North American continent. And so there are many desires to move west. There's an increasing population back east. We're essentially running out of room. We've got more people living in the same space. It's becoming crowded, so they want to find new places to live, and that's going to be in the west. Plus, and we'll talk about this in a later chapter, as the American government continues to drive Native Americans off their land, that's opening up land for white settlers to move into. So increasing population, a decreasing Native American presence, that's encouraging people to move out west. And migration is huge. After the War of 1812, we see 6 new states in 6 years. So on average, 1 new state a year is added to the Union after the War of 1812. And again, that's triggered by population. You have to get so many people in an area before you can declare it a state. So that just shows how huge migration is out west as we exit the War of 1812. And there's not just increasing population, not just decreasing Native American population. The West has always symbolized freedom for the United States. It's always been an opportunity, a new beginning for Americans. It's a chance to own your own land, for a clean slate, for a new beginning. Land is opportunity, and those that stand against expansion are those that are standing against freedom. They are obstacles to freedom. And again, this has been American thought since before there ever was America. Even back during the colonial days, we have continually pushed west. So that's a very big deal in the United States. In the southern U.S., we also see the beginnings of what will eventually become known as the Cotton Kingdom. Eli Whitney is going to be responsible for this. Eli Whitney is going to invent what's known as the cotton gin. That's short for engine, the cotton engine, which makes processing of short staple cotton possible. And the thing that there are 2 types of cotton, short staple cotton and long staple cotton. Short staple cotton can be grown in more places, but before the cotton gin, it was too difficult to process. It took too long, takes too much labor, it wasn't worth it. So you can grow it easily, but if you can't process it, it's not worth it. Well, once Eli Whitney develops the cotton gin, and you can now all of a sudden process this cotton that was difficult to process before, cotton explodes across the South. And the reason why this is important to the United States, number one, it not only revolutionizes the South, it also revolutionizes slavery. Prior to the cotton gin, slavery was actually thought to be on its way out. It had sort of served its purpose. It was no longer economically viable. These huge tobacco plantations are sort of dying out across the South. And so the institution of slavery was thought to be dying out in the South. But now, all of a sudden that we have this cotton kingdom, we have these huge cotton plantations that needs labor to plant the cotton, pick the cotton, process the cotton. This is going to revitalize slavery in the United States. Now, the importation of new slaves is illegal. It's in the Constitution. After 1808, you cannot bring in any new slaves into the United States. And so what we see is a new slave market develop between the old slavery places like, say, Virginia and Georgia into places in the deep South, places like Alabama, Mississippi, even in places like South Carolina. So we see a transfer in slaves from sort of these older, more established areas into these newer cotton kingdom plantations. Okay, and eventually, cotton is going to become the #1 export of the United States. It will become the #1 product of the United States. So it is a huge, huge deal with the creation of the economic, with the cotton kingdom. And we will see that as people begin moving out west, borders are not going to matter. They don't care if technically that land is owned by Native Americans. They don't care if that land is technically owned by a foreign country. A great example of this is going to be Florida, and we'll talk about Florida a little bit later in more detail. But remember that Florida still belongs to Spain at this point in time. Americans will not care. They will move into Florida, and eventually we will see with Andrew Jackson and the Seminole War, we are basically going to invade Florida and take it for ourselves. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. I just want you to realize that as people are flooding out west, they are not very organized, and the American government doesn't have a whole lot of success in holding them back. Now, with the creation of the Cotton Kingdom, the South is actually the most commercially focused area in the United States. All this cotton that we're growing in the South is actually for use somewhere else. It's being sold to places like New England and over the Atlantic Ocean into Great Britain, because the South doesn't have factories. Now, the South is overwhelmingly rural. There's no transportation, there's no manufacturing, there's no banking. We grow lots of cotton, but it's for use somewhere else. Okay, fine. The North is also beginning to commercialize. We see commercial farms. They're not growing food for the farmer to eat. You're not growing potatoes and tomatoes and wheat and corn. You're not growing a variety of food for you to eat. You're focusing on one crop. All we grow is wheat. We sell that wheat on the market, and then we use that money to buy things that we need to live. So we see commercial farms and manufacturing cities, and of course farming is helped along by technological advances such as the steel plow and mechanical reaper. Now, the market revolution also points towards another freedom. A man must be free to make his own way in the world, and we begin to see the rise of the individual. America has always placed such a premium on individualism. It's all about my successes. It's all about my freedoms. It's all about what I can do in the world. Individualism is so incredibly important to the American culture. It's all about this idea of bettering yourself. What can I do to make myself better? The idea of the free market. The idea that a person should be able to go out into the world and demand a wage that he is worthy of. That they should be able to go out, work hard, and make something out of themselves. This idea of the self-made man. These are not, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. That's an American ideal for as long as there has been in America. That's not something that's been developed in the past 15 years. That is something that has existed for essentially as long as there has been a United States. This idea of transcendentalism, that's a uniquely American philosophy. We'll talk about it in more detail, but in another chapter. But I want you to realize that the central idea of transcendentalism is the idea of the individual and how the individual is important to society. So it's not about the United States as a country. It's not about your town as a community. It's about you as an individual. Now, this also spills over into another social movement that has to do with church. As we move into the 1800s, church leaders are going to become increasingly alarmed because church attendance is at an all-time low. And so we're going to see church leaders such as Charles Finney develop a solution to fix this. They are going to organize a series of revivals designed to promote interest in the church. And this will be known as the Second Great Awakening. Remember, we had the First Great Awakening back during the colonial days. Well, this is the Second Great Awakening of American religion. Now, the end result of the Second Great Awakening, which was also true of the First Great Awakening, it is going to democratize American Christianity. And what I mean by that is, the Second Great Awakening is going to preach that faith is individualistic. Again, it's all about the individual. Faith is individualistic, and each person is capable of salvation by himself. You don't have to go through a church. You don't have to get the blessing of a priest or a preacher. You can sit down, read your Bible yourself, and gain salvation. So it democratizes. It puts everybody on a level playing field when it comes to religion in the United States. Now, the Second Great Awakening is also important because it also spreads over into social reform. It's not only about personal salvation, how can we fix ourselves, but it's also a means to reform or change society that we've grown uneasy with. Not just how can we fix the individual, but how can we fix society itself. And so that's what social reform is. How can we better society? For example, we see the beginnings of the temperance movement. The temperance movement is the movement to limit or even ban alcohol. Alcoholism in the 1800s, early 1800s, is a major problem in the United States. And so we see this movement to outlaw alcohol. And of course, that will eventually culminate in the next century with prohibition. So we'll be talking about temperance for the next few chapters. I also want to talk about the impact that it had on slavery. And this is huge. This is a very important deal, so I want you to pay attention to this. The Second Great Awakening is the principal subculture in America. It's the biggest social movement in the United States. And when politicians began realizing that everyone is taking part in the Second Great Awakening, and these social issues are becoming larger and larger and larger, the political parties began talking about these issues. In order to gain the support of the people that bought into the Second Great Awakening, politicians are going to parrot those issues. Well, if I know that the slavery issue is important to you, that's what I'm going to talk about. If I want to get your vote, I'm going to talk about the things that are important to you. Well, since the Second Great Awakening was talking about slavery, the politicians had to talk about slavery. And so what this does, it turns it from a debate point among people into a political issue, because now that politicians are talking about slavery, the people expect them to do something about it. And as these things become more than talking points, and as these issues such as temperance and most importantly slavery, as they come to define political parties themselves, we're going to see that has a major impact on the United States, because groups like the Republicans and later the Whigs and Democrats, they're not going to go out of their way to satisfy these new evangelicals. We're going to see new political parties such as the modern Republican Party sort of spring up, because they will be willing to talk about these issues. Okay, well, we'll get more into that as the semester goes on. But what I want you to realize about the Second Great Awakening is that it politicizes the issue of slavery. It moves it from a talking point, a social talking point, into a political issue. And eventually, just as you can see with politics today, once an issue becomes politicized, it becomes polarized. You're either completely for it or you are completely against it. And that is what really helps lead us down the road into the Civil War, is the politicization and polarization of the slavery issue. We'll talk more about that as the semester goes on. All right, let's talk about the triumph of democracy. Because there's three parts. We've already spoken about the market revolution. We've already spoken about territorial expansion. Now we're going to talk about the expansion of political democracy, getting more and more political power out into the hands of the people. And we begin to see a shift in the Republican Party. These new Republicans, such as John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, these men that were elected in as war hawks prior to the War of 1812, some of these new Republicans have some pretty interesting ideas on how to make sure America succeeds. They want to ensure that America does well for itself. And so this gentleman right here, his name is Henry Clay, he comes up with a system, the American system, designed to ensure a prosperous United States. And what were the details of the American system? Well, first and foremost, a national bank, which, as we know by now, we have the second bank of the U.S., so he succeeds on that. He believes in new tariffs. A tariff is a tariff is a tax on imported goods. Well, if stuff made in Great Britain and France is being taxed, that makes it more expensive, so you're more likely to buy American-made goods. It's an artificial tax. Tariffs protect American manufacturing. So they want a national bank. They want new tariffs to protect American-grown businesses, and they also want the federal government to get involved in the creation of a national roadway system. They want federal financing of public roads. Now, they get the bank and they get the tariffs. They don't get the roads. Of course, that will eventually happen, especially with the interstate system we have today. But for the time being, they managed to get the banks and these new taxes. Now, what does that look like? I want you to think back to a couple of chapters ago. Another guy had a plan for creating a strong, powerful United States, and his plan also involved a national bank and new taxes. If you remember, that was Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was not a Republican, he was a Federalist. So a lot of these new Republicans have some very Federalist ideas about where the United States should be going, and that's interesting. We're beginning to see a shift in the Republican Party. We'll come back to that in just a minute. For right now, I want to talk about the Second Bank of the U.S. The Second Bank of the U.S. becomes controversial very, very quickly. Just like the first one, it serves as the government's financial agent. It issues paper money. It collects taxes. It pays debts. Okay, fine. One of the primary jobs of the Second Bank of the U.S. is to ensure that money issued by local banks has value. At the time, there was not just one United States money. States could print their own money. Even large banks could print their own money. And it's one of the jobs of the Second Bank of the U.S. is to make sure all this paper money has value. Well, what happened after the War of 1812, there's a land boom. More and more people are moving out west, and as they're buying this land, they need loans to pay for the land, right? They need loans to buy the land as they move out west. Well, a lot of these banks begin printing paper money to pay for these new loans. Well, what happened was these banks don't have the precious metal, the gold and silver, to back this money up. By 1819, this bubble is going to burst, and as banks begin to ask for repayment on these loans, and the gold and silver is not there to back this money up, the economy goes into a nosedive. It's known as a panic of 1819. And as people lose lots of money in this panic, the Second Bank takes a lot of the blame because it was its job to make sure this paper money had value. And when it doesn't, it gets into trouble. The Panic of 18 doesn't last all that long, but it does disrupt the economy, and it makes a lot of people distrustful of the Second Bank of the United States, and it's going to directly lead into the next issue. We've already spoken about John Marshall in the Supreme Court. Remember, we spoke about him when we discussed Marbury v. Madison, this court case with judicial review. Well, I want to revisit John Marshall's court. Remember that he is an old school Federalist. He believes in a strong, powerful national government. He wants to advance the idea of industry and commerce, and he wants to promote the strength of the United States. He believes that the federal government is supreme to the states. And that brings us up to the next major court case we're going to speak about, McCulloch v. Maryland. What happened was, as people began to grow dissatisfied with the Bank of the United States, the Second Bank of the United States, we see several states try to tax their local branches. And their argument is, it's a business that's operating within our borders. All the other private banks have to pay taxes. This bank should have to pay taxes as well. So these states are trying to tax the federal bank. And of course, they're coming back with and saying, you can't tax us, we're part of the federal government. States can't tax the federal government. And eventually it goes to court. One of these bank tellers, his name is McCulloch. Maryland tried to tax his branch, and so he sues. And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. It goes all the way to John Marshall's Supreme Court. And there are two questions. Number one, is the Bank of the U.S. even constitutional? If you read the Constitution, it doesn't say anything about Congress having the authority to establish a bank. So is the bank even constitutional in the first place? And if it is Is the federal government supreme to the states? So it has two questions to answer, and it answers both of them. Number one, yes, the Second Bank of the U.S. is constitutional. There is a clause in the Constitution. It's known as the Necessary and Proper Clause, which said Congress has several duties, and in order to carry out those duties, it has the right to pass laws that may be necessary and proper to those obligations. So the Supreme Court said, well, Congress has the obligation to regulate commerce. They have the obligation to regulate money. Therefore, they have the authority to establish a bank. And due to the supremacy clause of the Constitution, the federal government is supreme to the states, and the states cannot tax it. So again, just like Marbury v. Madison, which strengthened the Supreme Court, this strengthens the idea of a strong central government. Okay, very nationalistic. Let's talk about the era of good feelings. As we exit the War of 1812, America is going to be riding high on a spirit of nationalism. After James Madison serves his 2 terms, he follows the tradition set forth by Washington and Jefferson, and he steps down. The Republican that runs for the presidency in 1816 is going to be James Monroe. He had no competition. The Federalist Party is completely out of power. There are only Republicans left. That's why it's known as the era of good feelings. You would think that since there's only Republicans left, that they would all get along. He was elected in 1816. He was reelected in 1820. There are no international threats. Generally, it's a time of peace in the United States. But as we near the end of his administration, as we near the end of his 2nd term, we are going to see storm clouds on the horizon. We are going to see politics begin to organize along sectional interest. And a great example of this is the Missouri controversy. In 1819, Missouri is going to apply for admission to the Union as a slave state. Now, generally, up to this point, new states had entered in pairs. You had one slave state, one free state. So the balance was always maintained. We had an equal number of slave states and equal as free states. Well, Missouri would upset this balance. It would mean that there are more slave states than free states. And this was a big deal because free states thought they would be outvoted. They're already jealous and angry at the South because it already seems to have more political influence than it should. Every American president, except for one-termed John Adams, has come from the state of Virginia. That's just the sort of example. They think the South is growing and expanding, and that eventually the more northern states are going to be overruled by the South, and they're angry about that. So the admission of Missouri would upset the balance, and so Congress moves to block not only the admission of Missouri, but the expansion of slavery itself. Well, eventually, we do come to a compromise. The Missouri Compromise says that Missouri would be admitted along with the new state of Maine, and that would keep the balance. Moreover, it also tried to answer the question of what are we going to do in the future. So what they said was, all land north of Missouri's southern boundary would be prohibited to slavery. And so if you're looking at the map, all the states in green are free states. All the states in that sort of reddish orange, those are slave states. So only the yellow territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma and Arkansas, only that territory is going to be open to slavery under the Missouri Compromise. Remember, that's all the land we have right now. The rest of the West still belongs to Spain. Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, all that area still belongs to Spain. So, blue area is possible free states. Yellow area is possible slave states. Nothing north of the southern boundary of Missouri could become a slave state in the future. And they held this as the compromise that saved the Union. Once and for all, this answered the question of slavery in the United States. There will never be another controversy because we've got the answer. If you're north of that, you're free. If you're south of that, you're a slave. In reality, it's a Band-Aid. This is a temporary solution that, as we know, doesn't do a whole lot to prevent the coming of a civil war. And as we see, the westward expansion of slavery is going to be a huge deal, and that's going to be a major component of the Civil War, but we'll get to that later. Now, under James Monroe, his Secretary of State, and remember, the position of Secretary of State is the traditional stepping stone to the presidency. His Secretary of State is going to be John Quincy Adams, who is the son of former President John Adams. And he is very interested in American expansion. Specifically, he wants to expand westward. And his first target is going to be Florida. Now remember, as I mentioned earlier, Florida is still owned by Spain. And the issue that we have with Florida, number one, we want it just because we want it. But number two, it's used by Native Americans to launch raids into the United States. Much like Canada was before the War of 1812, Indians would gather together in Florida. They would cross the border, kill a few people, burn a few homes, then escape back over the border, thinking that the army could not follow them because that would be the same as invading a foreign country. Well, that's exactly what Andrew Jackson does. He uses this excuse to basically invade Spanish Florida. He was in command of American troops along the border of Florida. And so he used these raids as an excuse to invade Florida. This is known as the Seminole War. Of course, the major Native American group in Florida are the Seminoles. And essentially, what happens is Andrew Jackson can't be stopped. Spain realizes that if we wanted Florida, we could take it by force, and they could not stop us. So when they realize they can't hold on to Florida, they give in and they just give it over to us willingly. Now, the important part about this is that when we take Spanish Florida, we give up all claims to Texas. That's kind of the trade-off. Spain says, we'll give you Florida, but in the future, you won't have any claims on Texas. And of course, as we all know, it comes to pass that we do take Texas. So bear that in mind. We get Spanish Florida, but we give up all claims to Texas. Next up is the Monroe Doctrine. Many countries in Latin America are revolting from Spain. The Spanish Empire is weak. It's on its way out. And many of their colonial holdings in Latin America are in open rebellion. Now, on paper, America is officially neutral, but in reality, we have strong business relationships with many of these rebels. We do a lot of trading with these colonies. And hey, we have a soft spot for rebels who are fighting for their independence against these huge empires. That was our story, and so we feel sympathetic to these countries or these colonies who are trying to become their own independent countries. So we begin what's known as the Monroe Doctrine, which is just a way of thinking. Basically, what we say is this. We are saying that Europe's time in the Americas is over. European powers are no longer welcome on American continents, and in return, the United States will not bother Europe. Europe will no longer be seen as a leader in the Americas. The leader of the Americas will become the United States. So basically, we're saying we'll stick to our business, you stick to yours. We don't want you in the Americas. If the Americas need leadership, we can give them leadership. You guys stick to your own affairs across the ocean. That's the Monroe Doctrine. European powers are no longer welcome in the Americas, and in return, the Americas will not bother Europe. The Monroe Doctrine. It's designed to keep the influence of the old world away from that of the new world. Okay, fine. That brings us up to the election of 1824. By this point, the Federalists are completely out of power, and so we see a number of candidates run, and they're all Republicans. William Crawford, who's a member of Congress, John Quincy Adams, who is the Secretary of State, Henry Clay, who is a very powerful Speaker of the House, and Andrew Jackson, who is, of course, an American war hero many times over. So this is what happens. It's very interesting. Andrew Jackson ends up with the most popular votes. You can see here, according to this chart, Andrew Jackson is the green color. He wins 153,000 popular votes, which gives him 99 votes in the Electoral College. In second place, in a distant second place, is John Quincy Adams. He has 108,000 votes, and he has 84 votes in the Electoral College. Now, remember, under the Constitution, if no one wins a clear majority in the Electoral College, you have to get 50% plus one. If nobody wins a clear majority, it gets thrown to the House of Representatives. Well, Jackson did not win a majority. He didn't get 50% plus one. He got 38%. So, just like it happened with Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, this election is going to go to the House of Representatives. Now, they have to choose between the top three candidates, which would be Jackson, Adams, and Crawford. Clay came in fourth place, so he's not an option. Well, Crawford, by this point, is an old man. He's not in very good health, and so he's not really a potential candidate. It's really down between Adams and Jackson. Now remember, the Speaker of the House is the leader of House of Representatives. And so Henry Clay is actually in charge of determining who's going to become president. He has enormous influence over who's going to become president. He sees Andrew Jackson as a political rival, and so he makes sure that John Quincy Adams is chosen as the next president. So even though, and that's what happens, even though Jackson got the most votes, he had the most people vote for him, and he got the most votes in the Electoral College. In the end, it ends up going to the guy who came in second place, John Quincy Adams. Jackson is furious. He's incredibly upset, and he refers to this forever after as the corrupt bargain of 1824. Now, it was completely legal. They followed the letter of the law to the T. This was completely legal, but Jackson did not like the result of it. So John Quincy Adams as president, unfortunately, much like his father, he's not going to have a very easy presidency. And the reason is, he's too much like his dad. He's very, very intellectual. He's very smart, but he's not very charismatic. He's very cold. He's very distant. He's not that great of a leader. And, you know, as one of these new Republicans, he is going to subscribe to Henry Clay's way of thinking. They're obviously political allies now. He wants to implement Clay's American system to make America into a world power. So you can see, again, that shift in the Republican Party. They're growing kind of more like the Federalists, the old Federalists. And this is going to scare some people. And what happens is, one of the reasons that Adams does not have an easy presidency is because Jackson is going to oppose him at every turn. Immediately after the election of 1824, Jackson and his supporters begin preparing for the election of 1828. And they are going to do whatever they can to stop Adams from implementing his plan. The Jacksonians are going to stop them at every chance. And what we eventually are going to see happen is a split in the Republican Party. We will see the National Republicans, as led by John Quincy Adams. They will be much more like the old Federalists than Jefferson's Republicans. And then we will see the Democratic Republicans as led by Andrew Jackson. And of course, this is really the beginnings of the modern, maybe not modern Democratic Party, but this is where we get the name, the Democratic Party today. That's the transition from the Republicans of Jefferson to eventually the Democrats of Jackson. Eventually they drop their Republicans and they're just known as the Democrats. And of course, we get to the election of 1828 and Jackson wins. It was a very hard-fought campaign. Both sides they were slinging mud about the other sides. Very, very bitter accusations made on both sides. And when Jackson wins, he immediately labels it a revolution again, just like when Jefferson came into the presidency and said, I'm going to change everything that Hamilton did. We're moving back to the spirit of the revolution. This is a new revolution of 1800. We see Jackson claim the exact same thing. This is an exact victory like Thomas Jefferson had in 1800. I'm going to bring about a new era of democracy to the United States. And so that's what we will be looking at next time.